first of all, everybody's enamored by the amounts of money that China is investing.
Yeah.
And the accepted wisdom is you're building infrastructure, this is only going to be for the good. Fact of the matter is that may not be true. First of all, the Chinese terms are very stark. They're financially not advantageous to the recipient countries. In some cases, you could argue that the commercial terms are neo-colonial in what they demand of the recipient country.
Yeah.
You've seen countries go into debt traps already, and as a result, Sri Lanka, for example,
Yeah.
and as a result, the Chinese get a far greater grip. You've seen social unrest, and at the very least unease across Eurasia with Chinese moves, including resettlement of people, land grabs. So, yes, there will be infrastructure.
Yeah.
But whether or not the One Belt, One Road really materializes as the Chinese envision it, and whether this is a win-win situation, or rather what one Chinese scholar called China wins twice, remains to be seen. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that China prides itself on its foreign and defense policy principles. Yeah. Non-interference, win-win, no foreign bases. And you've seen those in recent years, those principles de facto, if not de jure, being thrown out the window. And one driver of that, of course, is that China's interests have mushroomed. They've mushroomed in terms of the assets they need to protect, the interests they need to protect, and the number of Chinese nationals they need to protect, so a huge Chinese diaspora. But the other driver of that change has been the Middle East. The Middle East doesn't like neutral parties. Yeah. And the conflicts are such that China cannot remain neutral. Now, in terms of what neutrality means, China is an up-and-coming power. And in what likely is to be a multilateral rather than a unilateral world, unipolar world, one of two, probably three major powers. The Middle East expects them to live up to the responsibility of a major power. With other words, let's do business and leave all of this other stuff aside is not what many in the Middle East are looking for. The Chinese have been told that very clearly. Obviously, the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, certainly as it heats up now again, makes it even more difficult for the Chinese. But I think that you've got to keep a few things in mind. Iran is crucial to One Belt, One Road. The Gulf is not. The Gulf is an energy supplier. It's a market. It's an investor. But Iran has a geography. It also has relations with the Chinese that go far back, both in military terms as well as in many other terms. The Chinese are investing heavily in Pakistan. That's the single largest investment on the Belt and Road project. Gwadar, the port of Gwadar, is the crown jewel. The competition is the port of Chabahar in Iran. It's not a port in Saudi Arabia. Balochistan, as you see the Saudi-Iranian rivalry heat up, and just look at the last 48 hours with the resignation of the Lebanese prime minister, the firing of a missile out of Yemen, if you get an escalation of a proxy war, Balochistan is a prime playing ground. So I think things are not quite that simple for China. It's certainly being fought as a zero-sum game. The Chinese will certainly try and not get involved. I don't think they will have a choice. Take Balochistan. Balochistan is a very troubled part of Pakistan because of nationalist aspirations, because of great concern about the Chinese. So you have a city of 70,000 fishermen that's supposed to be 2 million people. That's 1,930,000 Chinese potentially. You have a lot of construction going on, but it's a lot of luxury construction for Chinese. You have 15,000 troops that have to protect the Chinese. You've had continuous attacks. So there are intrinsic problems there already. If you get a US-Saudi strategy to destabilize Iran, Balochistan will be one major playing ground in like Kurds, other minorities, but Balochistan certainly. And the Chinese will not be able to just look the other way because they are directly threatened by it. The problem is that China also has not been very successful in mediation, hasn't wanted to get involved in mediation. The way it looks at mediation is not what's going to solve these kinds of problems. So the question is not so much whether there's going to be a winner, but whether there's going to be a solution. Mohammed last week declared he was going back to moderate Islam. Saudi Arabia and the lands before the kingdom were established were never moderate. They were always Wahhabi. Yeah. I'm not sure what he means by moderate Islam. He hasn't defined that. And don't forget that this is a kingdom that was founded on the power-sharing agreement between the ruling family and the religious establishment. This is a ruling family that, unlike other Gulf ruling families, derives its legitimacy from religion. What happens if you take that away? What is their legitimacy? On what grounds do they rule? So one has to see how far they go. The other problem with this is you have a religious establishment whose vested interest is to maintain the relationship. So they bend ever further backwards in order to justify. In the process, they lose credibility. And so by definition, you're going to get more opposition, or you will get opposition. That's one problem. The other problem is that these ultra-conservative norms that have been part of the kingdom from day one are deeply ingrained in people. And so it's not a question of the opposition's going to be ultra-conservative and opposed to the reformists. There is that too. A friend of mine who's a Saudi academic recently interviewed 100 young Saudi men, and asked them, what do you want? They wanted to date women, they wanted to go party, they wanted to drive fast cars, and yes, they wanted jobs too. Yeah. So then my friend said, great, so your sister's going to go dating? Oh no. And they suddenly took a step back. So with other words, you're going to get mixed reactions. Someone can be all in favor of the reforms and at the same time reluctant to go as far as think, once he thought through what this means. So there's a whole process that has to take place for this really to be endorsed. And there's no indication that it's taking place. It's happening top down. There's no engagement at a time at which you are unilaterally rewriting the social contract. So the social contract was you get a cradle-to-grave welfare state in exchange for political subservience and acceptance of these ultra-conservative norms. There's no longer a cradle-to-grave state. People, ordinary Saudis, are feeling it in their pocketbook. And there has been no real return for that yet. Now, on the issue of the issue of the funding, I think one's also got to be clear. The Saudis have launched the single largest public diplomacy campaign in history. No one has done anything like this. So, estimates of what the Saudis have spent in the last 40 years go up to around $100 billion. Estimates for the Soviet Union were $7 billion. For the US, I'm not sure what the estimates were, but they were also very low. But granted, the US had a lot of building blocks. They had music, they had literature, they had architecture, they had Hollywood, you know, all important elements of soft power that were private enterprise, commercial. They didn't need to fund it. With the exception of 5 or 6 countries, Saudi Arabia has never funded violence. So these money, and again, it was not propagation of Wahhabism. If anything, Wahhabism was irrelevant. I mean, you look at the global ultra-conservative community today, Wahhabis are a small minority. It was whatever strand of an ultra-conservative Sunni Muslim worldview that would serve the geopolitical objectives of the Saudis, which was anti-Iran. So Salafis of all kinds of stripes, Deobandis, and you can go back to the 1960s and look at the exchange of letters between Abdullah bin Baz, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, and the Deobandis, wherein he basically openly said, I disagree with you, but we will support you, because that's what the government wanted. The 5 countries that I would exempt from that rule of nonviolence are Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bosnia, Syria, and Iraq. The problem with the Saudi funding is that the Saudis weren't always in control of what happened with the money. So you came to me, you said, I'm going to build a mosque. I gave you a check. There was no Saudi imam in the mosque. There was no Saudi on the board. I did with it whatever I wanted. You know, more moderate, more radical, whatever it would be. So the Saudis have let out a genie out of the bottle that they no longer can put into it. And obviously part of it is going to turn on you, whether it's Qaeda, whether it's the Islamic State, whatever. So the Saudis are in a sense stuck. I think they will continue to proselytize. With other words, they will continue probably at a lesser pace, depending again on when and where and in relationship to Iran. Are they going to proselytize something different? Well, when we figured out what moderate Islam means, we'll know.
Right now it's not too moderate. At least that we know.
I mean, look, there has been change in Saudi Arabia, let's be fair enough.
Yeah.
You've had stripping of powers of the religious, the mutawayin, the religious police. Yeah. You've had some significant change in textbooks. Not going far enough, but nonetheless. You have not had a lifting of any restrictions on the practice of, leave the Shiites aside for a moment, but other forms of Islam, Sufi Islam in Saudi Arabia, churches, Hindu temples, all of which are banned, and the worshipping of it is formally banned. There's been no move on that. I mean, when you start to see those kind of things, that's when you start to see what is the definition of moderate. Pakistan is a unique beast. It's the only, most Muslim countries are former colonies that became independent and had a majority of Muslims as their population. None of them were founded to be Muslim countries. Pakistan was. And so Pakistan's understanding of itself is very different and very convoluted. With other words, in theory, it was founded as a secular state, and yet it always had a pan-Islamic component to it. And so in many ways, they see themselves, minus the holy places, almost on par with Saudi Arabia. That's one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is that the Saudis have played a role in Pakistan from very early on. The death sentence of Alam al-Maududi, the Islamist philosopher and political leader, in 1953, was converted under Saudi pressure. The 1974 amendment of the Pakistani constitution declaring Ahmadis non-Muslims was under Saudi pressure. Zia-ul Haq, when he came to office in a military coup in '78, basically found a lot of common ground with the Saudis. And then you got the Afghan War, which was basically a US-Saudi funded enterprise, which ended in the Mujahideen, the Islamic fighters, defeating a world power. Most militaries come back and soldiers get post-trauma treatment. There's a whole process to bring them back into society after having been in very traumatic situations. There was nothing for these guys. And you had elements of the Pakistani state, particularly the military and the intelligence, where that ultra-conservatism had become deeply ingrained. And you had the funding. In a country whose education system is broken, they have no idea how many schools they have. 25% of children who should be going to schools do not go to schools. So you're kicking into an open goal. I think the Saudi expectation, because the Saudis obviously on the other hand continuously bailed the Pakistanis out. So when the Americans declared a boycott because of the nuclear weapon, the Saudis were providing the oil. When the Pakistanis need budget support, the Saudis were stepping in. When they needed some solution, when Nawaz Sharif, the first time around, was thrown out, it was the Saudis that negotiated the deal with Musharraf so that he could go into exile. And as a result, they basically felt Pakistan was in their pocket. So when you got in 2015 the Saudi request for Yemeni troops, for troops in Yemen, Pakistani parliament said no, and the Saudis were stunned. They didn't expect that. But on the other hand, when Raheel Sharif, the former commander of the Pakistani military, was offered to or asked to command the military alliance in Riyadh, the Pakistanis had no choice. They were between a rock and a hard place. If they were going to irritate the Iranians if they did it, and they were going to irritate the Saudis if they didn't. And so they figured the lesser evil was not to irritate the Saudis. So that relationship is much more complex. Just to end this off is, I mean, what you've seen in the last year is enormous amounts of Saudi money. And again, I think one has to be careful when one talks about Saudi money, because again, the lines get very blurry. With other words, what is Saudi government money? Either directly through government channels or through governmental, non-governmental organizations. What is private money? Purely private money? And what are monies that the Saudis are happy to see flow, but they're not doing it through official or semi-official channels? Having said that, you've seen in the last year an enormous amount of money go into ultra-conservative madrasas and groups in Balochistan. And what probably illustrates the whole thing, you had earlier this year the US Treasury designate a Pakistani by the name of Abu Turab as a globally designated terrorist and financier of Al-Qaeda. Abu Turab is a member of the Council of Islamic Ideology. That's a government-appointed council that's supposed to ensure that whatever legislation is passed by Parliament is in line with Islamic law. Not only is that, the day that he was declared or designated by the US Treasury, he was in Saudi Arabia. This is a man who holds lots of meetings, has these big banners, makes sure pictures are taken. The meeting ends, he takes the pictures, he goes to the Saudi embassy to collect. So that's the problem with Saudi funding in Pakistan. With other words, this is so ingrained and so enmeshed in the fiber of Pakistani society that you're not going to turn this around with a stroke of a pen, either in Pakistan or with Muhammad declaring moderate Islam. Fact of the matter is, the GCC today is not a functioning body. The problems within, I mean, keep in mind you have schematically three groups within the GCC. You have the Saudis and the UAE. You have Qatar, on the, and in the middle you have Oman and Kuwait, who look at what's happening and are concerned. I remember being at a security meeting in Bahrain about 3 or 4 years ago, where then U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel was openly backing the Saudi attempt to militarize the GCC. And you had the Omani foreign minister in open session standing up and saying, you do that, we walk out of the GCC. So you've got fundamental differences there already. Yeah. I think those differences have now been sharpened by the attempt by the Saudis, the UAE and Bahrain, which for all practical purposes is a Saudi appendix, trying to force their will on Qatar and having not only failed so far to do so, but failed to garner international support. The Qatari-Saudi relationship has always been a very troubled relationship. First of all, everybody looks at Wahhabism as a homogeneous unit. It isn't. Qatar has what it calls the Wahhabism of the sea, and Saudi Arabia has the Wahhabism of the land. So if you're a young Saudi looking across the border at Qatar, which of the Wahhabisms do you want? There's no question. This is a much more liberal form of Wahhabism. So already from that point of view, Qatar was a threat. Qatar is a country that was founded or sandwiched between two powers that are both allies or friends, theoretically, and threats, Iran and Saudi Arabia. And Qatar is the world's only other Wahhabi state. So they looked at Saudi Arabia and the power sharing agreement and said, no way. You know, so in Saudi Arabia you have a very strong clergy. In Qatar you don't. Their best known scholar is an import. You know, Yusuf Qaradawi. Qataris do not study in Saudi Arabia when they do religious studies. They went to Cairo, very deliberately. They come back, they're teachers, they work in the religious affairs ministry, in the Waqf, for whatever it may be. They don't become a class of scholars the government has to reckon with. Which also explains why Qatar had such a strategic relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. So that relationship between Qatar and Saudi Arabia is by definition troubled. And unless Saudi Arabia changes radically, and I wouldn't hold, I mean, that eventually will happen, but I wouldn't hold my breath on that in the short term. It's always going to be troubled. The other issue is the GCC, where one would think that all 6 nations have a vested interest in ensuring that the GCC remains intact and functions. That may or may not be true for the Saudis or the UAE in the current circumstance. But they're going to have to maneuver carefully, again, because what's happening with Qatar and how that Qatari GCC relationship evolves is of great concern to Oman and Kuwait. And the GCC may or may not be able to afford to lose one. It can't lose 3.